So this is the second video for the week 12 lectures. This particular video is going to be focused on pollinator health and how Ontario is addressing pollinator health. I'm going to start the lecture by looking at a little bit of history and background on why we have developed policy around this. So what you're seeing on this slide is some of the issues that have been identified. Pollinator health, mostly focusing on honeybees, has been a large media or has had a large media coverage over the last few years. And mainly because of some of the winter mortality rates that we have been seeing within honeybees. And so some of the stats I have up here is as that issue was coming to fruition, some of the information that we are seeing. So starting in 2010-2011 season, we saw 43% of honeybees within the hives having deaths over the wintering season. And when you look at that 2013-14 number, it really spiked up to almost 60%. And so when you compare this to what traditionally we are seeing within hives, that there's a huge spike and a big concern that was raised about what was happening to our honeybees. So an acceptable range, so not that there isn't ever any mortality within the hive. Obviously there are some mortality rates, but acceptable or sustainable level as reported by beekeepers is normally about 15%. And so when you compare it to some of these historical levels starting in 2010 to 2014, we are seeing a huge doubling, tripling impact of that overwintering mortality. The diagram that you're seeing on the left is Ontario's approach, that as we were looking at what was causing these mortality rates, we recognized that it could be a whole bunch of different issues that were contributing. So it could include pesticides, which tended to be the focus of the media reports and focusing in on neonicotinoids, but there was also some other components. So certainly pollinator habitat, and the nutrition or sustainability of the plants that may be feeding pollinators is a big component. We know that there's been lots of development within Ontario, some changes in tracts of agricultural land or open fields, and so that can certainly have an impact on pollinators. Climate change and extreme weather events, shifting seasons, looking at some of the extreme snow, rain, ice events could also have a serious impact on hives. And then finally looking at disease, pests, and some of the impacts that has on the genetics of the hives as well. So when we see that disease or we see some invasive species coming into Ontario, we know that that can have an impact on all pollinator populations. And when those events happen, we have seen some shifts and changes in the genetic makeup of those pollinators. So when we talk about pollinator health in Ontario, we are certainly focused on potential impacts of chemicals like neonicotinoids, as has been reported in other areas, but we're also taking a much more holistic perspective by looking at multiple other components that may feed into that as well. So as part of that assessment, the other component that I wanted to show you and some of the considerations when you focus in on that one piece of the pie looking at pesticides is that they were also seeing that there was a large die-off of bees during summer and fall months when we should be seeing the most activity of those populations. And so the stats that you're seeing here are some of the bee deaths that different beekeepers were reporting within their yards on number of mortalities over certain seasons. So again, part of this is looking at the potential use of pesticides and the types of pesticides that we've been using, not just in Ontario, but all around the world. And the focus has been on a specific type of pesticide, which is called neonicotinoids. So to give you a bit of background on that particular pesticide, it is an insecticide. So we are looking at trying to treat crops to try and prevent certain insects from infesting our crops. It is a synthetic insecticide, and the idea is it works a lot like a nerve gas. So it's a neurotoxin, and the idea is it's attacking the nerve synapses of those insects in order to cause mortality. And so there's several ways that insects, pollinators can be impacted by this. So certainly the neonicotinoids have been used in the past by directly spraying a crop. So it could be through that direct exposure onto their bodies. It could also be that after spraying there is a residue on the plant. So when a pollinator lands on that plant, it is continuing to be exposed to those components. There's certainly, I'm going to skip down to the last bullet. When you think about the movement of contaminants in the environment, there's multiple ways that that contaminant can move from the area where it has been applied to other areas. So when you think about direct spraying, there's aerial drift. We can be thinking about runoff. We can be thinking about infiltration into our soils, and then it may be contained there. From the soils, it can be moved from our waterways when it rains or there's snow melt and then runoff. So there's multiple other avenues where as that pollinator moves from one area to another, it can be exposed or re-exposed to those potential pesticides. The last component is an interesting connection to the crops and how we're using neonicotinoids. And so an important thing to understand about approach in Ontario and other regions, we have actually been pre-treating seeds with this insecticide. So before the plant is planted, so before the seed is planted, it is coated or dusted with the insecticide so that when the plant grows, it already has those. Essentially what we're trying to do is incorporate protective measures against insects onto that particular crop. So there's an economic linkage here, is that we were pre-treating those seeds to try and prevent some of the crop damage that we were seeing from different types of insects. Unfortunately, we are also exposing a whole bunch of other organisms, including humans. And so with any sort of chemical, we know that there can be that potential impact. So neonicotinoids have specifically been used in Ontario since the mid-1990s, and where we are using it the most is related to corn and soybean crops. And so we plant approximately 2.5 million hectares or acres, of each of those crops. Across Canada, we produce, within Canada, Ontario produces about 70% of the soybean and 68% of the corn across the entire country. So again, just to make a linkage back to the corn and soybean crops, we in Ontario have been pre-treating those seeds as a preventative measure in order to address some of our pest problems within corn and soybean fields. Right now, or historically, before some of these additional measures had been incorporated, approximately 100% of corn seeds and 60% of soybean seeds were treated with neonicotinoids. So looking at pollinator health and some of the policy changes that we have looked at within Ontario, there has certainly been a lot of public consultation. And so I just wanted to have a pause on this slide. What I'm showing you is some of the stakeholder feedback that has come as a result of the changes that the provincial government has put forward in order to address pollinator health and the potential impact by use of neonicotinoids. So I want you to take the opportunity to go into the links that I've provided. The first one is the posting that happened on the environmental registry and provides a summary of the comments. So if you go in and look at scope of proposal, it's going to give you some context about some of the policy that Ontario has created and give you a summary of the comments that various stakeholders and the public provided on the direction that we have moved. I also have a link here to the Ontario Federation of Agriculture's comments. And so remember, OFA is an association and they are representing the overall interests of farmers in Ontario. So they are speaking on behalf of that collective. Just to summarize for you, some of the things that you should be seeing come out as you're having a look at these different postings is that there was concern, particularly from the agricultural community, that the new approach that Ontario is taking is perhaps overly restrictive, and concerned that we were moving towards an overall ban of use of pesticides, and that perhaps maybe that was an unintended consequence of some of the assessments of the impacts of neonicotinoids. So from an agricultural perspective, their concerns were that this was going to increase costs for them in order to produce the food that they are producing, that farmers would have to switch to alternatives for pest management, which can also be harmful. So results of that is maybe addressing pesticides not as effectively or efficiently, but also some other components on linked to environmental degradation, increased in greenhouse gases because they will have to change their tilling practices, for example. The other concern was how would this impact Ontario agriculture and the crops and food that they are producing in comparison to other parts of the country or the world, and that were we reducing the competitiveness of Ontario crops in that particular perspective. Some other comments that were included was the need, before we move forward on a specific policy, for some full cost benefit analysis and risk assessment, looking at the potential impact of additional restrictions on pesticides, and then the need for creating a more comprehensive pollinator health strategy that looks at multiple stressors. And so this was the direction that the provincial government did take. So as a result of this early consultation with stakeholders, the approach that Ontario has taken is multi-pronged approach, where we're looking at all multiple components of what can be impacting pollinators and how we can be addressing each of those components. So a pollinator health strategy was developed in 2015. And so it did include those 4 key components. So pesticide exposure is one of those components, but it is also inclusive of climate change and extreme weather. It looks at disease and pests and how we manage that components and potential impacts on genetics of our pollinators. And it's looking at pollinator health within its own habitats and potential impacts on the food that pollinators may be accessing. The other point I should include here is that while the media was very focused on honeybees, the provincial strategy and the language that you're seeing here is pollinators. So we're going much wider than just the honeybee, although we know they are very important from an agricultural perspective for Ontario, that they are pollinating lots of the cash crops that we are creating. But we're looking at it from a wider environmental perspective, that we have butterflies and moths and other insects that also act as pollinators, that are important to the agricultural industry, but also the health of our ecosystems. And so it is very inclusive to be looking at that. So we do have a wider pollinator health strategy. And then we, as part of Ontario's process, there was a focus into pesticides and how we can better manage neonicotinoids within the framework we already had. And so also in 2015, there was some adjustments that were made to the Pesticide Act and the regulations under the Pesticide Act in order to specifically address neonicotinoids. And so we're going to look at both components. We're going to start in with the Pesticide Act and its general regulation, and then we'll move on to the pollinator health strategy. So let's start by looking at the changes related to pesticides specifically and focusing in on neonicotinoids. And so I'm going to get you to go to our eLaws website, and I'm going to have you look at the Pesticides Act. And there's a general regulation within that legislation that helps to direct how we are now approaching neonicotinoids within Ontario. So if you go to our Ontario Laws website and you find the Pesticide Act, remember, if you click on the second tab, you'll be able to see the details or the regulations that help control activities within that specific piece of legislation. So we're going to be using Ontario Regulation 6309, which is the general regulation under the Pesticides Act. Okay, so again, remember that when you're going into a piece of regulation, it's always associated with a specific piece of legislation. You can be looking at multiple versions, so we're going to be looking at the current version. So it was last updated in 2018, and we're going to be looking specifically at some of the changes that we have incorporated into the general regulation surrounding neonicotinoids. And so some of the specifics on that are incorporated into section 8.1, and I want you to have specifically a look at subsection 1, so that's within the brackets. So section 8.1, subsection 1, and I want you to look for this information. So when we talk about neonicotinoids, we are talking about treated seeds, so you'll see that language included into the regulation. And neonicotinoids is incorporated under what we call a specific class of pesticides. So neonicotinoids fall under a class 12 pesticide. So we have multiple classes, and that's where this pesticide falls. So as you're reading this specific subsection, look to see, are all seeds, pre-treated seeds, considered a class 12 pesticide? So are there certain types of crops that we're looking at? Or does it apply to any crop that we may be planting within Ontario? And specifically, what specifically makes treated seeds fall under the class 12 pesticide definition? Okay, so I want you to have a look at those sections. Pause the video. You can have a look and make your interpretation and then circle back to the video. So within the regulation, you should be going to section 8.1, and I want you to have a look specifically at subsection 1 within that section. All right, so notice that they are being very specific about the type of crops that this is linked to in that subsection 1. And you should also be seeing some names. And so when we talk about class 12 pesticides, there are some very specific types of neonicotinoids that are used in Ontario that we are focusing in on. And so when you look at how we are regulating the use of neonicotinoids, we're very focused on those 3 components and those 2 components of the types of crops that may be treated with that neonicotinoid. So the next component, once we look at how we are classifying the types of crops or so the activity and the types of neonicotinoids that we are using, the next component that comes within the regulation is to look at how we do the assessment. And so the regulation, if you go to section 8.2, it is very specifically outlining how we undertake that assessment, and that specific reports have to be generated from the farmer in order to outline the impact of pests on their crops. And so it's related to the use of those 3 specific pesticides that were outlined in the previous section. It does require farms to provide very specific details on their operations, so size of farms and what they may be planting, etc. It also takes into consideration the impact of the pest on the farm. And so that's the next component that I'd like you to look at within the regulation, is that we're going to have a review of section 8.2, and I want you to specifically have a look at subsection 1 and paragraph 4, okay? And that particular paragraph is outlining requirements for farmers that in order to use a class 12 pesticide, what must be shown as part of that pest assessment report. Okay, and so it's giving very specific direction on if a pest is found, some of the considerations that must be incorporated, or some of the evidence that must be incorporated as part of the pest assessment report in order to allow farmers to then be using that specific neonicotinoid. So I'll give you a minute, put the video on pause, and you can go into section 8.2, subsection 1, and go down to paragraph 4 in order to find these pieces of information. So you should be in the general regulation of the Pesticides Act, and you should be in section 8.2, subsection 1, and I want you to go down to paragraph 4. And what I want you to notice within this section is that it is providing very specific guidance on, so number 1, type of pest. So look at the language that's included within subsection 4, is that we're being very specific about pests referred to in the guideline document. So we'll have a look at the guideline document in a minute. And the idea here is that as part of the regulation, there's also some additional information provided in this guideline document about types of pests that farmers can be documenting. It's looking at very specific numbers of pests. So you should be noticing that it's talking about, so it can be 1 or more pests. So there is a relatively small threshold for evidence of pests. And it's looking at very specific areas within the farm, so whether it be soil or within crops. So the last component that you can be looking at within this specific section is that beyond just evidence of pests within specific areas of the farm, they're also looking at impact. And so within the guideline document, it's looking at impact related to specific pest thresholds, or it could be related to actual impact on that particular crop. So they talk about a stand loss threshold. Okay, so multiple components as we're doing that assessment. It could be type of pest, it could be the number of pests, it could be where that pest is found, and then the potential impact of those pests on the actual crop that is being assessed. So I'm just showing you now a screenshot of the pest assessment guideline document that was developed for the agriculture sector. So again, developed in 2015. Remember, a guideline document is meant to provide some of the plain language interpretation of the regulations and the requirements of this particular sector in order to identify or undertake the assessment process. So you can access this document through the link provided on the page. But just to show you that it's giving some very detailed components again about some of the definitions of what a pest might be, or the types of pests that can be incorporated, and some of the assessment process that can be included as on different areas within the farm. So whether it's within the soil or on the actual crop, and what some of the thresholds of those different components may be. As an example, if you dig into the document a little bit more, you can see that, again, we're focused on when you talk about types of pests. So the examples I have up on the screen here are, for example, grubs. They're looking at a specific threshold of grubs, and they give another example of wireworms, and that the threshold is different for that type of pest. You can also see that based on the different types of crops that we're looking at in managing neonicotinoids, the stand loss or amount of loss of the crop also differs. For corn, it's 15%, and for soybeans, it's 30%. So some very specific direction as we're undertaking those pest assessment reports. So we're now going to move into, so still within section 8.2, but we're going to move down to the next subsection, subsection 5. And I want to show you that as part of this update to the general regulation, there was recognition that there needed to be a phase-in of these requirements. And so we're going to look at what that phase-in looked like. So when you go to section 8.2, look at what happens. So there are specific requirements for a pest assessment report that is incorporated into that subsection, and look at what happened to those requirements after August of 2017. You can also see some of the phase-ins, and when you look at that phase-in, this particular regulation also uses schedules to be providing that information. So again, think about how we're using schedules within legislation and regulations. When you're looking at those schedules, I want you to find our particular area where the city of Barrie is. So we fall within Simcoe County, and look at when the requirements for this phase-in happened for Simcoe County, and then identify the date of when these requirements were also applicable to all regions in Ontario. Okay, so again, you should be in section 8.2 of the general regulation, and we want to be looking at subsection 5. So remember, the subsection is in the brackets, and what you should be seeing here is a phase-in, and what this particular phase-in is looking at is who is required to prepare the pest assessment reports that we just talked about. Okay, and so as a phase-in, initially, as this regulation came into force, you will see that in those early days, anybody could be using the guidance document in order to generate that pest assessment report. What you will see then is how that phase-in happens. And so notice dates that it happened over a period of a number of years. So this particular August, you should note some significant change that has happened. And so starting in 2017, we started to see some specific requirements of a professional pest advisor. So as part of the regulations that have created a position for a qualified individual who understands the requirements of a pest assessment report. And so it is that individual who is then required to be creating that report. And so the schedules that you see are then listing how that phase-in actually occurred. So I've just jumped back up to the table of contents because I do want you to be able to go and have a look at what those schedules look like. So if you do that, go back up to the table of contents and click on the first schedule. And what I want you to see is that those schedules are listing out different areas within the province. And so when you see those schedules referenced back in that subsection 5 of section 8.2, you see those different years when these different areas were phased in. So again, one of my questions was, as you look at these three schedules, what year, so date and year, was Simcoe County incorporated into some of the requirements to have that professional pest advisor complete those pest assessment reports. So before we leave the regulation, I just wanted to show you a couple of last slides to make it clear that Class 12 pesticides, the use of neonicotinoids has not been completely eliminated in the province of Ontario. The idea, though, is that it is very structured. Okay, so each year, the list of neonicotinoids based on concentrations of those 3 particular chemicals is updated. So annually it's updated and we create a listing of class 12 pesticides. This is the list of allowable treated seeds within the province and how that pesticide can be used. So you could note that the 3 key chemical components are listed, and it talks about specific concentrations that are allowable to be used. This is then linked in to consideration for that pest assessment report and occurrence of pests, where those pests are found, and potential impact on our corn and soybean crops. When you look at Pollinator Health within Ontario, as I mentioned before, we are merging some of the legislative and regulatory requirements into a broader action plan in order to manage pollinators and the health of pollinators. So this particular plan was created in that 2015 timeframe. And the idea of this plan is that it's going beyond just the regulatory prohibitive components of the legislative tools that we have. And so it's a really great example to show you that spectrum of policy tools that we have and how Ontario has incorporated it into their approach on addressing pollinator health. So you can have access to this document by downloading it through our webpage and this week's lecture materials. But I just wanted to highlight some specific components. So I certainly don't expect that you're going in and studying every component of that particular plan, but I wanted to show you that we have gone through that full spectrum of policy tools. So certainly we have the prohibit and regulate side of things on looking at how we are using neonicotinoid pesticides within Ontario. There is a highlight on best management practices focused on beekeepers and some of their best management practices. One of the biggest things that they've been looking at is looking at selective breeding and trying to breed in some genetic resistance to some of the impacts of disease, pests, and those sorts of things. So there's a focus on sharing knowledge and information among those experts. There are incentives provided as part of the Pollinator Health program, and most of these incentives have gone to private landowners, where we have the opportunity to protect larger tracts of land that can support pollinator health across the entire province. There has been some dedicated efforts and funding towards research and tracking the progress on how well we are doing at addressing pollinator health. And so I have some examples of that in the following slides. And then finally, there are lots of education and outreach components linked in to pollinator health. So some of it is advertising that we are incorporating. As you start to get out, and hopefully we can start planting gardens soon, when you look at plants that you purchase, lots of those greenhouses have started to incorporate some messaging that even some of those beautiful flowers that we're planting in the spring have also been treated with pesticides. And so there's lots of messaging coming out from your local garden centers and greenhouses to indicate bee population awareness and how we are planting our own gardens. I've seen lots of messaging from the city of Barrie about not mowing away or spraying for dandelions because they are providing some habitat and nutrition for our pollinators. There's lots of opportunities now, if you go into any garden center or look online, to be purchasing pollinator houses. to help support growth of our wild and native pollinators within Ontario. So this last slide is just circling back to the idea of research. I have provided a couple links here that direct you to the website where this material is included. So this is Province of Ontario material. So the image that you're seeing is from their drinking water monitoring map focused around pollinator health. And what the image is showing you is that the province since 2015 has been collecting information on neonicotinoid insecticide use, and potential impacts on multiple areas. The image I have here is looking at untreated drinking water sources and potential impacts. So they've focused in on 4 different pilot studies. So Innisfil is actually one of those pilot studies to see if we are seeing any concerns within our drinking water sources on levels of neonicotinoids. But there's lots of other research that is being done linked to presence of neonicotinoids continuing to occur in our soils, or potential impacts on our benthic invertebrates, because we know that they are our indicator species, looking at stream water, not just drinking water, and potential ecosystem impacts, taking pollen samples within bee yards to see if there's a continued presence of neonicotinoid, and to continue to assess pollinators such as bumblebees to see how they have recovered based on the efforts that we are undertaking. So a great example of the science that goes into informing policy development. And if you think about that process, that cyclical process of good policy development, that we are doing some monitoring and reevaluation of the policies that we have created, so that if we aren't meeting our expectations, that we have an opportunity to review that, update it in order to ensure that we are doing the best job that we can through our existing, whether it's the guideline documents that have been created or the legislation and regulations, to ensure that we are meeting our expected outcomes. So thanks for watching the second video. I hope that if you're having any questions as you're going through the video or completing the online assignments, that you also use the discussion forum that is available in our weekly learning folders. And by all means, if you're having any other questions, make sure that you send me an email so that I can get back to you promptly. Thank you.